Hello everyone and welcome back to Geezer Rider. On this channel we do a deeper dive into subjects, products, maintenance, etc. than we found elsewhere. The videos are generally longer, but that's because we're filling in a lot of the gaps that are left in other videos we've seen on the same subject matter. Please take a moment to like this video, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you'll be made aware when new videos are posted. We really appreciate you supporting us in that way, and we also invite your comments or suggestions for future videos. This will be another installment in the Heated Gear series, and I'll try to get it added to the Heated Gear playlist as well. This will be the review of the Gerbing 12V-CHR 12-volt harness and temp controller kit. That's a mouthful. We got a lot of information covered, so obviously in this video I'm going to be referencing my notes quite a bit to stay on track. Hopefully that doesn't get too annoying for you, but it'll keep me from steering too far off course. So what does the kit include? The kit includes the Gerbing dual port temp controller. It's G121AU-ACC-930. That is the part number, and that is how the device is packaged. It includes the Gerbing dual wireless remote G121AU-ACC-931, not 930. There's the UPC, and there's the device. And I've obviously had this out of the packaging before, as you'll find. And the Gerbing battery harness kit, which is G121-5U-ACC-903. And that's what allows you to attach to your battery and get power to the heated controller. The cost for the whole kit, all three of these pieces I just showed you, was $99.95, and I chose to buy it from the warming store. I saw that price point elsewhere, but I have a history of buying stuff from the warming store. They have good prices, obviously. First of all, have had good experience buying from them, good support, and they have a pretty decent return policy. And they also, because of the volume of products they sell, they generally have a good relationship with the manufacturer that they buy from. So they have resources, and we'll get into that a little bit, why that's important. Note that throughout this video, I'll sometimes refer to the individual ports on the controller as channels, but I mean the same exact thing by that. So I bought this controller in addition to my existing dual port controller that, if you've been watching the Heated Gear series, you may have already seen that review, because I've decided I'd really like to have an individual channel for each heated garment as opposed to daisy chaining multiple items off the same channel. For example, like running the heated pants and socks off the same channel as the heated gloves. So if you just had the two ports, you know, the jacket would be one port and then the other port would be the gloves. And then there's an accessory connector in the jacket, like in the case of the Gerbing LT jacket we review in the Heated Gear series. There's an accessory, and that's tied into the glove channel, so that would feed your pants, which then by extension would feed your heated socks or heated insoles. That means that your gloves, your pants, and your insoles would all be at the same temperature. And generally people, you know, they get more wind on their feet than they do on their hands, or vice versa. You know, you want to independently adjust those things and not have them all be at the same temp. So one thing's going to be too hot, or one or more things are going to be too cold. So I wanted to divide it up. So I chose this Gerbing dual port temp controller over other styles and brands for the following reasons. One was the dual port controller can be used on its own. It can be purchased separately from the kit if desired. I think it's like $69 or something like that right now. It has an LED display for each channel that indicates the heat setting, synchronization, or pairing status if you're using it in conjunction with the wireless remote, and also diagnostic codes, which we'll review in a little bit. The dual wireless remote that Gerbing offers to pair with this controller has a specific feature that we'll address in just a bit when we talk specifically about the remote. The controller has a last memory feature, meaning if Under specific circumstances, which they give the procedure for, the controller will remember the last settings when you disconnect the power on the controller and resume those settings when you reapply power. So for example, let's say you had the first channel for your jacket set to power level 3, and you had the second channel for the glove set to power level 4. Instead of turning the buttons to the off position, or the remote controller turn to the off position, you just left them at 3 and 4, and you simply disconnected power from your battery source. It'll remember those power settings when you reconnect the power. So if you stop for gas and those settings were good for you and they're probably going to be good for the next hour or the rest of the day, you don't feel like monkeying with anything. When you reapply power, it'll remember those settings and resume from where you left off. And that's pretty handy. So pardon me, thin little pieces of paper, difficult to separate. So as you probably already determined, the dual port temp controller can be used independently, like I mentioned, of the wireless remote. That means that if your remote battery dies in this thing, or the remote gets damaged, or the remote gets lost, or God forbid the remote gets stolen off the bike, you can still get power to your heated gear and adjust the power levels independently via these buttons on the controller. That's a big deal if you're 600 miles from home and it's freezing cold outside, that the thing still works and is still adjustable. And not everything else works that way, and we'll address that when at the end of the video. I'll do a contrast against my existing heated controller, and we'll do a bit of a stare and compare with features and functionality and talk about the differences, and that's what led me into, instead of getting another one of those, getting this Gerbing device. So let's talk about the dual wireless remote that comes in the kit for a moment. It too can also be purchased separately. That means if you're strapped for cash to buy the controller, you can get the controller, get all your gear wired up, and use the controller via its integrated buttons, which we mentioned here a moment ago, until you can afford to add the wireless remote. It's not that big a cost savings, especially if you wind up paying shipping, separate shipping on the remote. But, times are a little tough for some people right now, and, toys and want-to-haves aren't always at the necessarily at the top of everybody's list of what they should or can do at the moment. So for some people, that's an advantage, and you're not stuck with a manual controller because you didn't have the extra $25 to spare at the time of initial purchase. So what I mean is, some manual controllers don't pair with a remote. This one can work independently, and then you add the remote later, and not everything works that way. And again, this is about $25 from the warming store, for example. I keep mentioning them just because it's an easy go-to, but obviously you can do your shopping and get from wherever you want. The other item about this is that the potentiometers, so the potentiometers are the things that change the setting on the dial here, that they use are detented. That means that they turn and kind of click into individual positions. It's not a smooth rotation. They kind of fall into a recessed area as you turn them around. So it's after it's turned on, there's like 37 different positions. There's only 10 heat settings, so obviously that is not 37 different heat settings. You have to move multiple clicks to get to the next heat level. But this means that there's some resistance on the dial that helps keep it from accidentally getting changed to another position if you have it in a pocket or in a fairing pouch or tank bag or something like that. That's annoying if it moves around a little bit and it changes the darn setting on you. So this would help keep that from happening. Other controllers achieve this via less desirable design methods, and when I contrast my existing controller, that'll be another thing. Its wireless remote, how it handles maintaining position, contrast to this. So these potentiometers cost Gerbing more to use. They are absolutely more expensive to use with the detents in them than just the regular ones that other people provide, other manufacturers provide. So they obviously care about engineering a good customer product experience. There's a single LED on the controller, hopefully you'll be able to see it light up here, that indicates when the device is on and when you've rotated it enough to change the heat level to the next position. I don't know how well you're going to be able to see that in the, you know, if you have the sun at your back and this is mounted to your dash or something like that, but it's there. And I don't know how anybody else is getting around that problem either of direct sunlight. I have another unit which we're going to review, and it has LEDs, and you know, it's about the same. So the LED indicates that you hit either 1 through 9. It doesn't say that on here. It just blinks and says, hey, you achieved the next level up or the next level down. You rotated enough. However, the LED on the controller itself does. It says 1 is 10%, 9 is 90%, and then a capital letter A is 100%. So if this is tucked up inside your jacket, you're not going to know that. You're just going to know where you left the position and you were comfortable. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The memory function of the controller that we talked about earlier, where it remembers, we talked about leaving it in position 3 and 4, jacket and gloves, and it would remember after power was turned off. It will negotiate with the remote when you turn it back on and go, yeah, I remember that. This is where the position was. So we're in agreement. It's still 3 and 4. So they're not fighting each other on power on. So that's engineered to work together, and that's good. The other thing about this unit, and we'll see this again in the contrast, is that it uses a lithium button cell battery. It's a CR2032, very common button cell battery. So what that means is that this thing can be physically smaller, and it is a lot lighter. It's almost 50% lighter than the other remote controller that I have. And that can be a big deal if you have limited space in your tank bag, or you're trying to fit it into a smaller area or what have you. And it also means should the battery and the remote die, you'll readily be able to find a replacement. You'll be able to find a CR2032. And I know the others use like AAAs and AA batteries, and I'll address why I'm saying the CR2032 is probably a more elegant solution, even beyond size and weight in just a little bit. The one thing I do note about this, and this should be in the cons list and the pros and cons that we'll get to later, is that it does not have a little loop for a lanyard or something to help you secure it to the bike. I guess most people don't want to do that, so they're leaving it off. It's an area of weakness on the controller. Honestly, I have another one where I think it does have that little, hole through the corner so that you can put a lanyard through. But honestly, the first time you drop it on that corner, that's broke anyway, because like I said, it creates a point of weakness. So I'm not overly upset about that. We're going to talk for a moment about the battery harness kit. This is pretty typical. Let me get it out of here real quick for you. So it comes with 6 fuses they give you, ranging from 3 amps to 20 amps, so you can customize for your specific gear and protect your bike's battery and charging system from excessive power draw and other mishaps. That's typical of most harnesses. They're going to give you the extra fuses of varying sizes. There's also a weather-resistant cover that's included for the power connector end. It's got a fairly decent grip on it, at least while it's new. And it's weather-resistant, not weather impervious. Help keep debris and moisture out of there when you're not connected. You don't have your heated gear connected. That doesn't seem like a big deal, but I have gotten other harnesses that do not include this, so it's something to look out for. The length is not overly long, but I think it's going to be generally sufficient for most people's use. Probably could be a little extra long. I know for my particular use, it's not going to be too short, but for other people, this I've had others that were a little longer than this. For the connection to the battery, and we covered this discussion in the phone, the wireless charging phone mount, talking about ring terminals and spade lug terminals, and one's good and one's bad, or one's better than the other. So they don't use a spade lug terminal or a ring terminal. I don't know how well we're going to be able to see this here. They've got this hybrid thing that's kind of like a ring terminal with a groove cut into it. So a spade lug terminal is just like this, and you try and put it under the screw on the top of the battery. If you look at that, I don't know how well you guys can see that. And the problem with the spade lug terminals is you're turning it and it's twisting and it's always trying to back out. And if you're in tight quarters, if your battery's in tight quarters on the bike, that's hard to do. With a ring terminal, you know, it's a solid ring, and you know, the screw goes through it into the battery and it's held captive there. So this would be closed and, you know, it would hold on there. The problem is sometimes everything's tight down there. You don't want to back the screw completely out. Maybe there's other accessories you have there and they're all going to pop off. So with this, you can back the screw off enough to slip this underneath of it and hook it on there, and that'll help hold it in place. You only need to put a little bit of tension on it to keep it in place and then tighten it down. So this is something different that's not common. They probably paid a little bit more for that connector than just a regular ring terminal or spade lug. So again, you know, they're actually putting forth some extra effort and probably some extra cost to give you a better experience. The tag's pretty much in the darn way, speaking of tight quarters, but there's no doubt that you have red as positive and black is negative, or, you know, in this case, the yellow tag is negative or common or ground, whatever you want to call it. They've used heat shrink to cover the ring connectors here to avoid shorting out against anything else, both on the positive and the negative cable. And there's also a little bit of heat shrink on either side of the fuse connector. There's heat shrink where it transitions from there to the output cable diameter. And then again, they have a piece of heat shrink at the end for basically just indicating power. That's red. It's not doing anything but just sitting on there. The use of heat shrink isn't always that common. I've got others that don't have that nice transition like this, or heat shrink in all the other places. It's just, you know, a crimped butt connector style or crimp connector. This is obviously much higher quality than that. And again, you know, the advantages of buying from Gerbing, it's going to be good stuff. The fuse holder, I've got these before where they were just a piece of hard plastic. They weren't pliable at all. This just has a tiny bit of a rubberized feel to it. I think that's going to do well in extreme heat and extreme cold, and also make the fuse holder a little more weather impervious. If you don't ride in the rain, then when you wash the bike, you know, help keep moisture out, etc. But dust and dirt in there is no good either. So it'll keep the fuse lugs from corroding. The output wire has real good insulation around it. It's a nice diameter, you know, because of all the extra insulation, you can see what's actually inside there. So this is pretty thick, and that'll help it keep it from getting abraded, or if it's close to a heat source, from, you know, getting overheated and melting the interior wires. And other harnesses I have do not use this quality of wire, definitely not that diameter. The gauge, I leave the harness out of the pros and cons, so I'll just hit that here. This gauge of wire, I mentioned that the fuse is ranged up to 20 amps, and they make reference to use of a 20 amp fuse. This looks kind of light to me in general, especially the negative cable. For whatever reason, the black one looks thinner diameter than the red. So I'm not real keen on running 20 amps through this. I'd probably cap it off at about 15 if I were you. Thinner wire means lower power capacity, and it's more likely to get hot if you draw a lot of power through it. Like, I would expect this wire to get warm if you pulled 20 amps across it continuously, and that can lead to insulation degradation and power loss. So, you know, it's like a toaster. Toaster gets hot, it heats up the element that's drawing a lot of power. So what you have here is basically, once you draw enough power through this wire, it becomes a toaster wire. I don't think that's going to happen to you at 20 amps, but it's definitely going to heat up or warm up, you know, this thin little wire here. So if you have, you know, the need to draw 20 amps concurrently, you know, your total load off of this is going to be 20 amps, and you're going to run it continually, and you have the ability to run 20 amps continually, you might want to look into another harness that is made with thicker wires, or call Gerbing or whomever and get them to guarantee that it's good for that. You know, I'm just looking into the end of the connector here at the diameter of the wire. It's actually not copper, it's silver colored, or appears to be. So yeah, I think 20 amps sustained is probably a little unlikely, but we'll see. If you have any comments about that, feel free to make them on the channel. Appreciate it. So let's get into our pros and cons list that I mentioned before, and we're going to start with the dual port controller. So as mentioned, it can be used independently, and each channel can be manually adjusted. So why don't we go ahead and do that now? Still wrapped up a bit, but we'll get power to it. So this is literally connected to a motorcycle battery, just like you would have. You plug it in like this, as almost all heated gear does. It flashes, lets you know the power's on. Let me go through that cycle again for you. And one of the channels goes to the last that it remembered. And you can cycle through the numbers here. 8, 9, that's 90%. And again, 100% is A. And one more is down to 1. And I believe if we press and hold, it turns off. So being able to use this without the remote, in case something happens to the remote, or you buy it without a remote because you have cost considerations, that's good. You can manually adjust each channel by pressing these buttons. And it's obviously, it comes from Gerbing, so it's well made, and the cables coming out of it all have proper strain relief. So if you can see this strain relief here and here and here, that's something that's going to help keep this wire from breaking over time. This is going to be, you know, coming out of your jacket, and you're going to be tugging on it and moving it back and forth, connecting power on the bike. This will be up inside the jacket and moving around as you move around, and the stuff is, you know, up inside the accessory pocket or the equipment pocket inside your heated jacket, for example. And that'll help make this item last a lot longer. And you don't see that strain release from other manufacturers. The LED output on here shows the pairing status, and it's A when you hold down both buttons. All right, there's your 2 A's that says, hey, I'm ready to pair with the controller. And then I turn on the controller, and I get a light on the controller and rotate it until something shows up and it says, hey, I've seen, yep, there we go. Now I've seen input from A, so it says you're at 100%. I'll back it down to something lower. So now we're down to 70%. It shows the current heat setting. Obviously, we were at 7, which is 70% there. And then there's also diagnostic info that'll show up on here when you're having a problem. And it's a capital blinking L if the battery voltage drops below 11 volts. So if you've overtaxed your charging system and your battery and run it down, like you've been using all your accessories at maximum setting while you've been idling, you know, in a traffic jam for 45 minutes, it's gonna flash a capital E if the current goes, a capital L if the voltage drops below 11 volts. And it'll do a blinking capital E if the unit goes into overcurrent protection mode. So we talked about that 20 amp threshold a little bit earlier. So if you have a short in your wiring, if this turns out to be undergauged, if your accessories, you know, your heated gear draws too much power, or using too much of it concurrently, or you have too much of it set to too high a setting, then it will do the flashing E and let you know that you've gone above the current load. And, you know, obviously it'll stop supplying that amount of current. You know, it's say, hey, that's too much, I can't do it. And that will protect your charging system on the bike, the battery, and also protect the controller. And again, we already mentioned that you can buy it bundled with the remote, or you can add the remote later. Cons: this controller is physically larger than some of the other controllers, including the one that we're going to do the stare and compare on later. And that also feeds into con number 2 for this controller, and that's that these buttons are actually fairly easy to push. So let me turn it on. I'm not having to push overly hard on here to get it to click into the next position. So while that should be seem like something that should be in the Pro column, hey, you know, maybe it's easier to adjust when wearing gloves. It could actually be a con, since when the controller's put up inside the pocket on the jacket, the accessory pocket I talked about too, all these connectors are up in there with it. And, you know, they're going to get misrouted over time. You know, stuff gets moved around, and you can start to begin to see how something in that jacket, as you move around, if you bend over to pick something up or what have you, and you're connected, or, you know, lean over for some reason, that the buttons could inadvertently get pressed as you move around on the bike. So if you look at the Gerbing heated jacket review video we did, we specifically talk about that pocket and how everything's all pushed up in there. And you'll start to get an idea of what's going to be in that equipment pocket and the various connectors and how that could potentially press against these buttons. So that'll be something I bring up again after a long-term review, if that becomes a problem or not, but I can easily see where it could happen. And the third con is, when doing my research, I observed multiple posts that there's been an issue for some users when trying to maintain pairing between the controller and the wireless remote. And we're going to talk more about that after addressing the wireless remote. So let's get into the pros and cons for the wireless remote. One is the pros. First one is the previously described detented potentiometers that help maintain dial position and do that better than other makes and models. And again, we're going to contrast that against specifically the warm and safe wireless controller that I already have in just a bit. The LED indicator on the remote front that tells you when the receiver got its input. I think that's pretty common now. I know in the beginning it wasn't. You had no idea whether it told it or not. All you knew is whether you were warm enough or it was getting cold on you, so it had failed. You know, but you know that it went to the next position, even though you don't necessarily know what the number is, because this is hidden up inside your jacket. And as previously noted, the remote uses a lithium button cell battery. So that means that the battery will last longer than a remote that has just regular alkaline AA or AAA batteries in it. And by extension, that means the remote is smaller and lighter. We talked about that just a moment ago, than remotes that use those traditional AA or AAA batteries. Now, in the warm and safe remote, it does take AAA batteries, and I bought lithium AAA batteries for that because I didn't want anything that would leak. I've had alkaline batteries that leak or corrode, and rechargeable batteries that leak and corrode, and I wanted it to last a long time. I didn't want to be, you know, swapping out batteries a lot. But it is honestly easier usually for me to find a CR2032 battery, you know, replacement button cell battery, than it is to find lithium AAAs. In addition, the CR2032 battery is usually a lot cheaper than lithium AAAs, like a third of the price maybe. So the cons of this is, and here we get into some of my, you know, first world problem or my OCD issues, is that the off position for the dials, if you're looking at this, and you imagine this is a clock face. Right now, they're at about 10 a.m., right? And that's off. And if you view it as a clock face, 100% is around 8 p.m. And again, this messes with my OCD in that usually the off position is more likely around 7 p.m. right down here. And then 100% is over here somewhere around, you know, the 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. position. So you're just going to have to get used to this and determine which dial setting is appropriate for your gear, for your bike, for your weather situation. But to be fair, that testing routine will be true with any controller. It's just that the dial indicators on this controller are less intuitive to me anyway because of that offset. Nothing that should keep you from buying it. Obviously nothing that kept me from buying it. The battery access is under a label on the back of the controller. And this is something that really peeves me off, and we're going to get into a little bit more about this label and the battery access in a minute. So per Gerbing tech support, you need to peel the label off in order to access the screws for the cover for the little access door for the battery that's underneath this label to replace the battery. Well, as you can see, that sticker has a lot of good information on it, including the model number of the remote, the serial number of the remote, the model number of the battery you need, the CR2032, and the dial heat settings, like approximately where you should put it to get 50%, you know, stuff like that. You're definitely going to want to save that sticker after you have to peel it off if it doesn't get destroyed in the process. And I think Gerbing could do a better job of die cutting the sticker around the little door, or having punch outs for where the screw or screws are for the door, versus making you rip it off of there and having to trash, you know, that way you wouldn't have to trash the sticker. I mentioned in the pros and cons for the controller that I observed multiple posts that there's been an issue from some users maintaining pairing between this wireless remote and the controller, and we'll dive deeper into that in a moment. So my final thoughts on this kit is that, and we're still going to talk about the pairing issue, but my final thoughts on the kit is that it's a good value and worth buying, which I obviously did, right? I bought the controller, I bought the whole kit. So I got the controller, I got the wireless remote, and I got the battery harness. I didn't need the battery harness. It was already part of the kit, and honestly, it was more expensive to buy the two items separately than have it included with the harness. That's just the way the deal was. The setup is feature rich and provides options not available in most of the other brands or models that I researched. At the moment, I'd recommend this to a friend. And I say at the moment because we're going to get into the pairing issue in a second here. You know, and we'll see how we get Gerbing, see how we do getting Gerbing to address the pairing issue, which I'm currently experiencing, and how the setup does over time. And we'll add this device to our long-term follow-up to review at a future date and let you know how, you know, we made out with Gerbing and how it's doing over time and how it compares with the existing controller. And now, the detailed information on the pairing issue, the problem statement. In short, the controller is supposed to remember the last setting, if left on, when the power is disconnected until its next use. And the pairing between the controller and the wireless remote is supposed to be persistent. It's supposed to remain after power is off to the controller. It should immediately resume as soon as you restore power to the controller. And according to Gerbing's representative, for a long time, like hours and hours, days, etc., maybe months. You know, I can see after a whole season having to repair it at the beginning of the season, that might be fine, or after a month's worth of non-use, something like that might be reasonable, but certainly in not what my experience is. And that is what I and apparently others have that I've seen posted online have noted, is that everything appears to work fine as long as power is restored quickly. So maybe within 2 to 5 minutes. Any longer than that, the pairing is lost between the wireless remote and the controller. Also, the controller wouldn't remember the last setting if the power is off for more than like 5 minutes. And again, you know, that's because, you know, you get, you know, whatever your range is, 200 or 300, 300 and a quarter, 350 miles, and you have to stop for gas and maybe a restroom break or something to eat, what have you, and before you know it, 5, 10, 15 minutes, half an hour has gone by, and you go to get back on the bike and you start rolling down the road, you know, get back on the interstate or whatever, and all of a sudden you realize you're not getting heat, you know, or you can't adjust the heat because it forgot the setting, you know, went back to off or nothing or what have you. That's a big annoyance, and that's not why it was bought. So the users that posted online, their ultimate resolution to the issue over, you know, multiple users consisted of replacement of the remote, replacement of the controller, or in some cases they both had to be replaced to resolve the problem. And there was a date range of this over several months at least. You know, we're obviously in the heated gear season right now, so there's going to be more posts now than there would be otherwise. So I would imagine by this time next year we'll have the long-term tests. Hopefully it's just a bad batch. Remember, I referenced the serial number being on that sticker earlier. So, hopefully Gerbing will identify it, and, they can have a way to contact their resellers like the warming store and say, hey, whoever you sold this product, have them send it back and we'll replace it free, whatever the case may be. So what I did was I first contacted the warming store, which is where I purchased the kit, as I mentioned, and their rep went through the pairing scenario with me and agreed that my connections and the procedure I was using was correct, and that the unit wasn't functioning correctly. They then stated that they'd have a Gerbing product specialist call me back. I wasn't optimistic about how long that might take or if it was even going to happen, but it was literally within like 45 minutes I got a call back from the Gerbing product specialist. And I don't know whether that's their internal Gerbing product specialist or they actually reached out to somebody at Gerbing, but the person was fairly knowledgeable. And the Gerbing product specialist I spoke with was aware of the issue. So they know that this can or does happen, but seemed surprised that I had found as many instances of it online as I had. And I should note that in those threads where people were, complaining about the issue, the other people were like, hey, that's odd. I've got the same exact models and I'm not having that problem. So again, I think maybe a particular batch. They're getting these items from overseas and stuff happens. So the Gerbing product specialist was aware, kind of taken aback at how many instances of the issue that I found online. And they say that generally the solution that they'd seen was to replace the remote as, and I quote the Gerbing product specialist, that is what tells the controller the last setting was. That is incorrect. And I called him out on it and said, and this was the only mistake the rep made, was because the controller's documentation says that it remembers the last setting used. And it has to also know about the synchronization. It can't all come from the remote, even if the remote initiates it. It's a pairing, it's a handshake. So, we took issue there, and the rep agreed with me. But as we stated earlier, this thing can remember the last position used even without the remote. So obviously that statement was incorrect, and the pairing issue is the larger issue to be resolved. So the rep then suggested I go buy a battery for the remote and try that. Well, I obviously didn't care for that testing methodology for two reasons. One is it's a brand new product and I shouldn't have to pay for the battery. Two, there was no guarantee that would be the fix. And three, I would have to destroy the label in order to replace the battery, and then I would have damaged goods, and they would go, oh, well, you monkeyed with it. We don't know what you did to ruin it and replace it. I'm not saying they would go down that road, but I've had that experience before. So the rep then said that they would send me a new remote to begin the diagnostic process, and we'd go from there. Now, personally, I'm pretty doubtful the remote will be the solution for this because of what I noted previously, that I think that the heart of the pairing issue is in the controller, but we're going to go ahead and go through their process, work the process until it's a resolution. So at the moment, it's just an inconvenience of time, and obviously not being able to use my new gadgets is intended for the cold weather rides I had already scheduled until this is resolved. It's probably going to be about a week from, maybe a week and a few days from the time this airs. I had the conversation with them yesterday. So it'll be, let's say even 2 weeks before I can even test it and see if the replacement remote works. And then we're going to go from there to the controller, what have you. But they are working with me. They were responsive. They took, accountability for my satisfaction. And I think that's the Gerbing difference versus some of the, X brand stuff you find on other online sources. We'll just put it that way. So why am I still recommending this kit? and I think I touched on this just a moment ago, because I know the warming store will make it right in the end. I also know Gerbing will make it right in the end, regardless of who you bought the kit from. I've been dealing with Gerbing for years, and the few times I've had questions or issues, they've always resolved them and did so as quickly as they could. They truly care about customer service. I mean, if you ever have to talk to these guys, either at the warming store or Gerbing, you'll figure that out pretty quick. And my guess is they got a bad batch of either the controllers, the remotes, or both from the overseas manufacturer, like I suggested earlier, and are working through the issues until they're all out of the supply chain. And as I noted, there are also numerous comments in the problem threads from people who said theirs weren't giving them any issues, so they didn't know what was unique to the people that were having the issue. So again, maybe old and new, problematic and not problematic manufacturing batches. So before we dive into the comparison of this and my existing controller, if you haven't already, please take a moment to like the video, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you'll be made aware when new videos are posted. We really appreciate you supporting us in that way, and we also invite your comments or your suggestions for new videos. All right. Okay, I previously mentioned that I bought this Gerbing dual port temp controller over other brands and models, and I obviously did so even though I saw some of the users having issues with maintaining pairing. So let's take a moment and let's compare the Gerbing setup against the warm and safe dual wireless controller I already owned, and contrast the features and functionality. So we're going to leave the wiring harness out of the equation for now, because I already have a different wiring harness on the bike, so it doesn't matter. And we'll contrast the warm and safe and the Gerbing. So let's start with the remote controllers. So first off is the warm and safe heat troller is obviously thicker, and since it has the two AAA lithium batteries in there and a larger housing, it's probably about 50% heavier than the Gerbing equivalent. I think that this housing actually might be a little tougher, a little more durable than the Gerbing controller, but hopefully I don't wind up throwing this thing around. I did mention that the warm and safe controller did have the little holes through the side. I don't know how well you can make that out on this camera angle, to slip a lanyard string through, and the Gerbing does not. The other thing is that even though it uses the AAA batteries, the 4 micro screws in each corner that hold the back cover on to access the batteries are obviously unobscured. There's no label over them that you have to compromise or anything like that. One thing that the warm and safe controller has that the Gerbing controller does not is 2 LEDs on the front, and they're actually protruding through the housing. May help with visibility a little bit, so that you know when it's receiving input from the left channel and the right channel. The Gerbing just says, hey, I'm flashing a light for whichever one you use. And I guess if one of the channels was dead and you turned it and it didn't flash, it just wouldn't flash, and if the other one was working, it would. So I don't look at that single LED as being a drawback. The dial position you can change because there is a set screw on the side of the knob that you can loosen and rotate it to wherever you want. So OCD Me has the off position in the 7 p.m. position like I talked about before, and that means that when I turn it all the way around to 100%, then the 100% position is in about the 6 p.m. position. So again, 7 a.m. went off, 6 p.m. went on 100%. That's pretty much an industry standard. Don't know why Gerbing deviated from that. And you can rotate this to whatever you want. And I know that this is probably going to be almost impossible to see in this light, but this does not have the detented potentiometer. And these things just rotate super freely. So the cheesy way they handled this to provide friction was put a couple O-rings behind the knob that rub up against the potentiometer, that threaded part that sticks through the housing here. And what you do is you get a little tiny flat blade screwdriver, you loosen that screw, and then this knob can rotate freely. You push the knob in against the controller and tighten that screw, which compresses that O-ring. And then you have to test and see, is that too tight? Like, is that almost impossible to turn it? Or is it providing just enough friction to keep it from moving on its own? So I can overcome it by just putting the weight of the controller on there once it's turned to the on position. And I'll just this one's a little tighter, so it's rotating a little slower. And that resistance is going to change whether it's hot out or whether it's cold out. If it's cold, there's going to be less resistance because everything's contracting. And if it's hot, there's going to be more resistance because everything's expanding. That's a really cheesy solution to this. It does help provide, a bit of a seal for these protruding potentiometers. But I would much rather that they be detented potentiometers like this, which was a failing that I noted when I first bought this thing. A failing in that it isn't what I wanted to see. The syncing and everything is probably fairly similar, but the warm and safe controller is a little more elaborate. I won't dive into it because that's not the point of this video, but they ship pre-synced. The Gerbing does not, but the procedure is so easy it really doesn't matter. So let's take a quick look at the warm and safe dual port controller versus the Gerbing. So this is all in a tamper-proof, rubberized housing. This thing is weatherproof as heck. It has a couple of LEDs, the standard connectors. I would say that this was made really well, except for one thing, and that is we talked about the strain reliefs that the Gerbing has. Look what does not. This warm and safe does not. The wire's just hanging directly out of this rubberized housing, and eventually, with enough play, that area will crack. When you apply power, you get a couple LED lights for status. And when you turn the knob on the remote, let's see if I can stack this up for you here. You should get a response, and it'll tell you once it's reached the position you set it to. It'll flash a couple times, and same true for the other channel. It'll stop, and we'll turn up a little more, it'll flash, and then it'll stop. And again, this is prepared. So that couldn't be much easier. What's the advantage to this, if there was one? The advantage is, the disadvantage is you don't have the separate buttons. You can't use this independent of the wireless remote, with a caveat that I'll get to in a moment. You can't adjust this without the wireless remote. The good thing about it is it doesn't have any buttons that can accidentally get pushed on it up inside the jacket. Again, we'll see over time if that's really an issue. And I'm really trying hard to find something in the plus column for this. And it's also kind of almost the same form factor as far as length and width, but depth is obviously much less obtrusive. So this, you're going to notice this thing in the accessory pocket of the jacket. It is big. It's like the size of the old-fashioned hardwired ones with the potentiometers that were right on top of the controllers that you would strap to your leg or to your tank bag or something like that. They're just still using that form factor. Warm and safe, to their credit. You know, this indicates really good engineering that everything's in this form factor. It's a switching power scenario, which might be inside this as well, you know, more advanced electronics, but the form factor is larger. So this kind of wins it on form factor, being that it's smaller and less obtrusive. But I think as far as being feature rich, the Gerbing actually is the better way to go. And again, what I wanted to do was add an additional channel or channels or ports, so that I could have one for the jacket, one for the gloves, one for heated pants when I get a pair of heated pants that don't have their own integrated controller, and one for heated socks or heated insoles, whichever you prefer, because generally all those things need to be a different temperature. And again, daisy chaining off the glove channel, having the gloves, the pants, and your heated footwear all at the same temperature generally is a compromise at best. Now, I did say that there was a caveat for this if something should happen to your heated controller. So let's say for the warm and safe. So let's say that the thing gets broken, lost, or God forbid, stolen off your bike, and you're out in the freezing cold and you have this thing and now it can't talk to the controller, it has no buttons. The default is if it can't talk to anything, it just sets both channels to 30%. The problem with that is there's a possibility that that's not going to be warm enough, and the other possibility is that might be too warm, depending on the conditions or how efficient your gear is or whatever. And the whole idea about heated gear is keeping you comfortable, which keeps you safe and keeps you from getting distracted. So if those 30% settings during that, breakdown mode or what have you don't work for you, you're going to be distracted because something on you is sweating or something on you is freezing or just not quite warm enough or not cool enough. So that is our review of the Gerbing heated controller. I hope you found this information helpful, and obviously there's probably a lot more here than you will find either on Gerbing's site, their videos, YouTube, Revzilla, or whatever. I realize this is long, it's a lot to package. I'm looking at my notes, notes that can be a little bit annoying, but we generally don't redo what somebody's already done if it's been covered in detail. I only go into, on this channel in depth when I see that there is a gap in the information or stuff that isn't being called out. So again, we'll get back with a follow-up on the synchronization issue. I think it's all going to be resolved to my satisfaction. The question is, how did it happen and how long did it take? And we'll get back to you on that. Then long-term test results of the controller and the buttons getting inadvertently pushed or not. Hate to keep asking, but again, if you haven't already, please take a moment to like the video and hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you'll be made aware when new videos are posted. We really appreciate you supporting us in that way, and we also invite your comments or suggestions for future videos. Thanks. Ride safe. Namaste.